Hey everyone, I'm Mike. I'm an aspiring professional artist and welcome to my channel. So in today's video, I'm going to be talking about the 5 secret tips that will help you draw anything that you want. Alright, let's get started. Alrighty, so let's go to point number 1, which is observation. Now this is a kind of vague one, right? It's a little bit out there or abstract, but I think it's the most important. So let's look at a quick example. So this is a piece by Mark Brunet. If you want, you can go to this website that's right here on the screen. I'll put it in the description as well. This website, you're able to get all of these kinds of references for free, which is fantastic. But let's look at this. So what do you see when you look at this particular image, right? So some of you might have just said, well, it's a woman holding a sword, right? Some of you might have said, well, it's a woman holding a sword with her hip kind of pointed out, and she's looking at us. But that's not really observing what you see, right? And really what you're going to end up getting if you have observation like that is something that's a little bit more like this, right? You're just kind of seeing the outline of this character, and that's not necessarily going to help you when it comes to actually drawing anything. So let's look at what I might see, for instance, and I'll just focus on the upper body. So I'm just going to look like right in here. So some of the things that I see is I see that there's a slightly different tilt in the head, which is tilted this way, and the chest, which is actually tilted that way. And what I mean by that is we're seeing more of the side of the head than we are of the side of the chest, right? So that's something that I'm seeing. If I even go further than that, I'm seeing different parts of the muscles. I'm seeing that the deltoid is splitting this arm right in half almost, this upper part of the arm on this side, right? And then on this side, I'm seeing that the deltoid is moving away from us in space, which means we're not going to see too much of the triceps, for instance, right? I'm seeing different things like the clavicle or the collarbone is tilted like this, right? There's a slight tilt this way, which is pushing the ribs that way as well. And then, I mean, this is a little bit past the torso, but I do want to make this point. I'm also seeing the tilt of the hips. So those are just some of the observations. I could kind of go on, but I wanted to make this point very clear. In order to draw anything that you want, you have to be able to go from viewing just this to viewing all of this. Alright, so the next thing I'm going to talk about is shape and form. So what's the difference? So shape is more so, and this is kind of my definition. There's definitely other definitions out there, so don't, take it with a slight grain of salt. But shape is the two-dimensional object, or the two-dimensional version of the object that we see. This is a really important thing to think about as you're drawing things, because if you don't get the shape right, it doesn't matter if the form, which I'll define in a second, is correct. The overall shape isn't there, so it's not going to look like what you're trying to draw. Whereas the form, so shape would be something like a triangle. The form would be something a little bit closer to a pyramid, right? Form allows you to think about things like shading. It allows you to think about the dimensionality of a particular object that you're looking at. Form also helps indicate what's happening on the inside of a shape. So for instance, you can have an oval, right? And that's the shape, right? But you can have the form be something like this. And this is really important, right? Because this has transformed how we view the shape. So you can see there's a divot in the middle of the shape in here. and there's almost ridges right in here, right, on the outside. So you can kind of feel that this shape is kind of depressed in the middle and kind of comes out on the outside. But this doesn't work very well if the shape isn't there, right? So you're probably thinking as well, like, what are some of the things that I can do in order to help me with shape and form? Well, exercises like this one that I just did are really important. Drawing just shapes all the time when you're kind of bored, so you want to be able to kind of quickly draw a cube and have it look relatively cube-like. Practicing things like your circles, thinking about how to also split up these shapes in half and things of that nature, which this is a really important exercise that I'll also get to later. But doing things like that will allow for you to really work on shape and form, and it doesn't take too much thought. Now, if you want to look at shape and form and observation together, something that you can do is get something like this, for instance, like a case or something, or like a mouse or something of that nature, and you want to actually observe it and draw what you're seeing and try to replicate it through shape and form. So this is kind of the foundation of what it means to really observe objects, being able to look at the shape and the form of the object. Alright, perspective. So perspective is very, very important. I'm not going to really explain too much. What I will say is an exercise that you can do to kind of practice your drawing in perspective is something like this, right? Where you're just working on 1 point perspective, and you should be measuring these things out, like, actually, because look, I already made an error. So making sure that you're actually connecting it to that point. I have a couple of videos on perspective. I'll probably redo those videos at some point in the near future. But perspective is extraordinarily important, specifically when you're looking at shape and form as well, because your perspective is going to make things feel balanced and grounded within your work. Some of the things that I see pretty frequently with people's work that they send over to me to like kind of give them feedback on is they don't have an idea of the perspective of their drawing, so they end up with characters where, for instance, the shoulders are like this, and this would be like a standing pose front view. Shoulders are, or 3/4 view, the shoulders are like this, and then the hips are kind of like this. The head is like that, and you have features going here and here, and what happens is it throws off how real that object looks. The same is true of like a building or like a cube even. So if I were to take a cube and take this perspective out of the equation, this is a different perspective grid. If I were to take a cube and do something like this and not really think about the perspective, it creates a different shape. This is no longer a cube. It can still work as a 3D shape, but it isn't a cube. A cube is the same on all sides. It has the same angles on all the sides as it's going back into the perspective grid of your work. The same is true again of like bodies and feet too. So for instance, feet are super important in making your characters feel grounded. If they're not on the same plane, and it's not an intended thing where one foot's up in the air or something of that nature, then it's gonna really throw off your character. So perspective is super important. Practicing things like this where you're just, and this again doesn't take too much, but you're just practicing too much brain power, but you're just practicing taking those things back into perspective. You want to do 1 point, 2 point, and 3 point perspective. And the only real difference is 2 point, you want to have 2 points out here, and it's going to look something like this. Very, very quick and probably not the most accurate thing on the planet. And 3 point perspective is the same thing, but you're also imagining another point way down here. So everything gets kind of pulled to 1 point or the other, right? So that is how you would practice both, or all three, 1, 2, and 3 point perspective. And again, this is vital to kind of having realism within your work. Proportion. So Proportion is interesting because a lot of people just think of it as a body, for instance, and making sure you have, like, I don't know, the arms in proportion to the legs and things of that nature. But proportion can mean a lot more than that. Proportion is really kind of defined as things relative size to other things, right? So, for instance, you having a scene, right? If I were to take a scene and I wanted it to be dramatic, and I have a character kind of in the foreground of this scene like that, and I have another character that's kind of menacing, huge, looking over top of this character. This is a pretty dramatic scene. It's very sketchy, but it's pretty dramatic, and it makes it feel as though, I don't know why I just did that. It makes it feel as though this character right here is really imposing their will on this character, right? But that doesn't work if the next scene or the next panel you have is a side by side and your characters are like this, right? So they're the same exact height and size. So that's why proportion is so important in that aspect, right? And this doesn't have to be characters. So for instance, this could be, I don't know, this could be like a building versus a car. I'm not gonna like actually freehand a whole car, but that doesn't really make sense, right? Versus like if you really drew a car next to a building like this, that might make more sense, right? The sizing, the proportion of it. This also has to do with things like faces, for instance. So if you're not able to think about or memorize the proportion of a face, you're going to have trouble with different parts and consistencies within the face. So for instance, you should know that the eyes are one eye length apart, right? You should know, for instance, that the brow line right here is from the brow line to the top of the head is about 1/3 of the whole height of the head. You should know that the middle of your eyes is almost exactly the halfway point of your head. Things like that. Without knowing those things, you're not really going to be able to create consistency or create scenes that make sense to your viewer. So without proportion, you're not able to actually observe things correctly, and therefore you're not actually able to draw anything, right? So these are the things that you really want to think about when it comes to proportion. How big are things in relativity to other things? That's really what proportion is. So the next one is another pretty abstract one, and we're going to end here. Theory. So what are theories? Theories are tools that we can use to help us do two things: draw from observation as well as draw from imagination. So for instance, if I think about the theory of counterbalancing bodies, the theory would tell me that if I have a body where the torso and the clavicles are going this way, then, here, let me finish this out for you, then I need to have the hips going the opposite direction in order to create balance within our work. So, for instance, let me get this in for you. So now you can see there is a balance in here, and it's almost like this harmony, even though it's coming together from my imagination. I'm kind of thinking about this actually from earlier. Even though it's coming together from my imagination, it's coming together in a way that's appealing, right? But this theory is also something that we can use for stuff like this, right? This is what you saw me doing in the very first point. I was looking at these different kinds of angles and stuff like that, and how those work together in order for me to be able to observe and then draw. So that's one example of a theory. what's another theory? Well, another theory might be clothing theory, for instance. There's a billion of these. I'm going to give you clothing theory and then one more example and I'll be done. So clothing theory tells us that where there are tension points, there are going to be folds. So let's say we have a piece of cloth that's wrapped almost like a towel around these two tension points, right? So what we're going to end up getting is we're going to end up getting a slight divot down in here, and let's just be lazy and connect it this way. So what we're going to have is we're going to have folds that go in between these two tension points but are also being dragged down by gravity. So you're going to get maybe a couple that are like this, and then slowly but surely you're going to get something like that. Now, again, this isn't perfect, but this is the clothing theory. And this isn't, again, not perfect, but it looks like a piece of cloth, right? If I were to erase the little tension points, you can feel the tension here. You can feel that this cloth is actually being kind of held up like that, right? So that is something that would help you with clothing. The last one that I'll think about or talk about is going to be like atmospheric perspective. Perspective. So this theory allows us to think about how things are implemented depth-wise. So what atmospheric perspective tells us, and I have an entire video on this, so please search the channel for that video, but it tells us that things that are closer to us are, one, a little bit more defined, two, have more brightness and darkness, and three, are actually going to have less blue because of the air in between us and the more distant objects. So as things go back in space, they actually lose some of that color that they have, some of the outline that they have, and they actually start to gain more blueness. And that helps kind of see a little bit, helps us see a little bit more depth within our work. And it's also going to make the lines as they go further back smaller and smaller, and in some cases, if it's far back enough, it's going to transition to almost black in the foreground, right, to going towards a light gray in the distance. So these are some of the theories. There's plenty of theories out there. Please, there's color theory. Just make sure you're looking it all up and thinking about that as you've gone through the other steps that I kind of laid out for you, because this is going to help again with your observation, and it's going to help you put things together as you start to draw stuff from imagination. So these are my 5 steps in helping you be able to draw anything that you want. I hope that this was extraordinarily helpful for you. I enjoyed putting this together. If y'all have any videos that you want to recommend, you can either do it in the comments or make sure to go ahead and check out the Discord. I like to give people feedback. I hang out with people. I do voice chats every once in a while as well. So if you want to get to know me a little bit better, that's where you could go. Alrighty, I hope that this was helpful for you, and I will see you in the next one.